Suppose the vital pulse of a nation to be for ages animated, its internal spring and life for ages saturated and leavened with the spirit of such a system as that of Hinduism, a system which, by confounding the creator with the creature with the creator, tends to annihilate the very feeling of moral responsibility, or, if conscience will speak out, points to a scheme by which man may practically assume to himself the merit of all that is good and attribute to deity the demerit of all that is evil. Suppose the external form and manifestation of a nation's life to be for ages cast into the mold of those countless observances which are the spontaneous growth and product of such a system as that of Hinduism, observances beneath the shelter of whose divine sanction or divinely appointed expiations there is no act of lying or deceit, fraud or dishonesty, vice or immorality, theft or plunder, devastation or bloodshed, which may not be perpetrated with a free and fearless impunity as to future retribution. Suppose a nation to be for ages so inwardly saturated and so outwardly molded that what could we expect to find as the resulting condition of the myriads of its people? What could we possibly expect unless a condition, the most degraded and demoralized, the most wretched and miserable? And is not this by universal consent the present condition of the millions of India? Suppose next salvation and eternity were for the moment kept out of view. Suppose our consideration were wholly limited to the narrow span of time, and as it were simply asked, how is the temporal estate of India's teeming population to be ameliorated, their personal, domestic, and social happiness to be augmented, their individual and national character to be elevated and improved? What must be the soundest and most enlightened reply? In the endeavor to return a practical response to such a question, the men of this world are not slow in propounding their varied specifics. Those who attribute most of the evils to the influence of a grinding despotism tell us that the establishment of a representative government and free institutions, the investiture of the great body of the people with principal rights and political privileges, would, by achieving the emancipation from a tyrannical yoke, raise them in the scale of civilization, comfort, and earthly felicity. What enlightened mind is not ready to acknowledge such a government and institutions, such rights and privileges to be among the greatest of temporal beings and productive of the greatest temporal good? But does not all experience prove that these must be the effects, the results of something antecedent, ere they can become the causes of any real and lasting consequent good? For what are the institutions and privileges in question? What but the visible forms in which certain previously excogitated opinions and cherished principles are embodied? What but the external organs for the full manifestation and development of these principles and opinions? To attempt, therefore, to regenerate a people by bestowing upon them free institutions at the very outset, when as yet they are literally steeped in the very slough of bondage, intellectual, moral, and religious, individual, social, and political, is surely to begin at the wrong end. It is to confer forms that are the sensible vehicles of principles and opinions totally alien from those which ages have rendered inveterate. It is to bestow physical organs adapted and designed to manifest principles and opinions absolutely diverse from those which immemorial usage has tended to consecrate. What is this but to attempt to convey to an infant the strength of a giant by forcing into its hands the club of Hercules, or to impart to a fool the wisdom of a philosopher by investing him with an academician's gown, or to convert an Icelandic waste into a tropical garden by suddenly transplanting into it the saplings of palmyras and tamarinds? Incongruous and abortive attempts first convey to the infant the giant's strength, and the newborn vigor will spontaneously inhibit exhibit itself in seeking for the giant's weapons, impart to the fool the intellectual energy of the philosopher, and this rare endowment will spontaneously develop itself through the medium of appropriate external symbols. Communicate to the sterile waste the heat and moisture of a tropical clime, and these vivifying powers will spontaneously manifest themselves in the most luxuriant produce. In like manner, first imbue the mind of an enslaved people with the true spirit, the true genius, the true sentiment of rational freedom, and these will speedily manifest their inherent power by shaking off like an old-fashioned and worn-out garments the positive forms and organs of an oppressive despotism, and at one and the same time clothing themselves in the representative forms and developing themselves through the congenial organs of a free constitution with its equitable sanctions, rights, privileges, and laws. Others, convinced of the impossibility of effecting and the consequent mockery of pretending to effect the regeneration of an utterly ignorant and depraved populace by any merely political expedience, have recourse to the plans and projects of the economists. The impoverished and famished condition of the people, they say, is the originating cause of most of their miseries. Only increase their wealth, their capital, or the means of personal comfort and refinement, and you will render them happy and flourishing. In order to do this, there must be a diminution of the land tax and other public burdens. There must be the introduction of an enlightened system of commerce. There must be a skillful development of the internal resources of the country. There must be the application of machinery to the varied products of a soil exhaustless in its fertility. There must be increased facilities for communication and exchange by the construction of roads and railways, canals and bridges. Now all this is very good, excellent and praiseworthy, so far as it goes. What philanthropist would not rejoice to promote any plan which promised to effect the alleviation of human suffering, the augmentation of human bliss? But in the present circumstances of India, is not such a scheme of economical reform, equally with that of political reform, when proposed as the primary antecedent measure, obnoxious to the grand design of beginning at the end instead of the beginning? Or even if it were not, how would its most unbounded success secure the great ultimate end in view, namely the real prosperity and permanent happiness of the people? Suppose the wealth of every individual, from the humble occupant of a bamboo hut to the lordly proprietor of a marble palace, were increased tenfold or 100-fold. What influence, immediate and controlling, would mere affluence exert in bridling passion, extirpating vice, abolishing superstition? Rather, while the mind and morals of the people remain unreclaimed, would not the inevitable tendency of an increase of wealth be to open up an enlarged sphere for the indulgence of every wayward desire and propensity of corrupt nature? While the spirit of Hinduism remained in its entireness, would not an ampler scope be afforded for the manifestation of its baneful power? The enhanced profits of the lower orders, instead of being transferred to the public treasury, would go to swell their offerings to priests and idols. The larger revenues of the noble and the powerful, instead of being applied to develop the boundless capabilities of the soil, would be expended in throwing new splendor over the celebration of rites and festivals, which might minister to their pride and love of fame in this life, and hold out the prospect of raising them to the enjoyments of a higher heaven in the next. The improved resources of the Brahmins, instead of being appropriated to real enlightenment of the popular mind, would be lavished in restoring and multiplying those purely scholastic seminaries and idolatrous fanes and other establishments, so well calculated to command the reverence, to rivet the mind and heart, to engross the passions and interests, and to enstamp the manners and customs of a sensuous, apathetic, imaginative people. The improved facilities of intercommunion between the different provinces would only tend greatly to augment the number and prolong the period of meritorious pilgrimages to distant shrines and other holy places. In this way, every additional increment to mere wealth instead of ensuring a harvest of reformation and enduring prosperity, might only enlarge the springheads of that general corruption which must ever terminate in confusion and ruin. Chains of iron might for a while be converted into chains of gold, but the people would be manacled and miserable still, and only the more hopelessly miserable, inasmuch as the road to destruction would be strewn with more alluring though not less elusive fascinations. Persuaded that if men be vicious and depraved, mere wealth would either leave them unchanged for the better or make them more vicious and depraved than before, numbers have risen up to assert that something more is indispensable. Ignorance, they say, ignorance of the laws of nature and of true science is the main source of vice and unhappiness. Only give men knowledge, useful scientific knowledge, and you will enlighten, reclaim, and elevate them to a new platform of earthly bliss. As if the wisdom of this world were resolved as long as possible to pass by, the only efficacious instrument, morals and religion, have been excluded from this reforming scheme. Since both in India and in Britain it has found the ablest advocates, it is well to consider its peculiar adaptation to the end in view. How often we have heard of the streams of useful knowledge flowing through the land and fertilizing the intellects of the people into a rich harvest of reason and intelligence. Yea, after the manner and amplitude of oriental hyperbole, how often we have heard this knowledge compared to a mighty ocean which has already begun and is finally destined to encompass the whole world of intellectual being. Well, granting for a moment to the adorers of knowledge their very heart's desire, might we not for their special edification push our own parallel into a few particulars? Modern knowledge, they say, is like the great ocean, seen to roll its waters on every shore. What then? And if, like the great ocean, it has its serviceable tides, may it not have its destructive inundations too? If, like the great ocean, it has its depths profound, may it not have its straits and shallows too? If, like the great ocean, it has its roads and havens, may it not have its rocks and quicksands too? If, like the great ocean, it has gales and gentle breezes, may it not have its storms and tempests too? But are we left to mere hypotheses on this subject? No. Let us then briefly advert to the mode in which human knowledge without religion does, in point of fact, usually operate. Experience amply justifies that everywhere the heart of man is naturally proud and selfish, his intellect dark and degraded, while selfishness leads him to convert his own progress in any branch of knowledge into a test of its superior excellence. The degradation of his intellect slavishly binds him to the exclusive pursuit of that which is merely natural, having no spontaneous relish for those sublimer spiritual truths that specially concern the interests of eternity. This knowledge, however, from its variety ceases, and from its adaptations to the natural intellect, fills all the avenues of the soul. Hence the man who is much occupied with his favorite theme, soon becoming enamored of it, gradually attains to proficiency, and at last succeeds in acquiring a reputation for learning and wisdom. This very naturally redoubles his zeal and his diligence. As he proceeds, his intellect grows in strength and becomes rampant with confidence. It exults in detecting the weaknesses and failures of others. It glories in its own achievements and acquirements. It trusts implicitly to its own sagacity and relies exclusively on its own resources. It is filled with self-sufficiency and swollen with self-conceit. And as the very frequency with which it may have formed theories and pictures of morality and religion too often renders it insensible to the practical obligations of both, it soon acknowledges no master, pronounces its own light to be sufficient, scorning to yield reverence even to the high and holy one, who alone is light and truth and life and goodness. Every unsanctified intellect thus becomes a tyrant, every master intellect a master tyrant. The more splendid the talents, the deeper the shades that are cast on a nature already, alas, very dark and very depraved. The more towering the genius, the more tremendous the engine for spreading devastation through the empire of truth and order, godliness and sobriety. Now, when many are so trained, so disciplined, and so prepared, society, like the luxuriant but deceitful verdure that clothes the precincts of the volcano, has attained to its state of greatest external brilliancy and internal decay. And the elements that long slumbered only to accumulate the greater strength must at length burst forth in desolating fury. All bonds are broken, all obligations dissolved, all rights abolished, all government subverted, and all things sacred and profane trampled underfoot by a tyranny that is merciless, just in proportion to the light and knowledge and power of the unsanctified intellect. Is this an imaginary picture? Would to God that it were! Unless all history be a riddle, and its lessons the visions of a dreamer, this, in the present corrupt state of human nature, is a portraiture of the inevitable tendency of all unsanctified knowledge, a tendency to which the experience of ages bears its unimpeachable testimony. But why refer to past ages? Why not to the events of our own day? And amongst these, why not to the most terrible exemplification of the tendency and effects of knowledge without religion, recorded in the annals of time? Some of the original founders of the modern French philosophy about the middle of the last century were beyond all debate, in their own sense of the term, philanthropists. For was not theirs a system which, without the aid of religion at all, according to their own calculation, was to regenerate the world? Before their system, was not barbarism everywhere to give place to civilization? Preponderant rights to equality and tyranny to liberty? Was not truth so long buried beneath the rubbish of centuries of ignorance and error to experience a species of resurrection? Was not reason so long befooled by prejudice and superstition to be restored to her rightful ascendancy in the intellectual firmament? In a word, was not the new philosophy to construct an altar whence the flames were expected to ascend and spread and brighten till they poured the stream of illumination round the globe? Magnificent rising sun of promise, doomed how ingloriously to set in darkness! Alas, the heart of man is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? No one who does not see it clearly reflected in the spotless mirror of God's own word. The encyclopedists and the economists and the whole body of fraternizing Illuminati of France, in casting that eternal word in derision away from them, did thereby cast away the only lamp that would have guided them through the labyrinth of heart's natural perverseness. Who then need wonder that, wholly ignorant as they were of the real nature of the disease, they should have blundered fatally in prescribing a remedy? And has not the disastrous issue accordingly shown that, instead of kindling a light which might illuminate the world, they were only fanning a flame that was soon to envelop it in a general conflagration? Ah, if one of the better intentioned of the earlier fathers of the new philosophy had only arisen from the grave and alighted in the vale of Paris during the midnight gloom of the Reign of Terror, if there he had met in personified forms his own philosophy metamorphosed and undisguised as atheism, openly proclaiming that there was no God and that death was an eternal sleep, and along with atheism her legitimate offspring, Savago anarchy, yielding his tremendous scimitar, fresh reeking with the blood of thousands of unhappy victims slaughtered in the name of humanity, methinks he would start back as aghast at the hideous aspect of his own double progeny, as the archangel fallen from the shapeless monsters he encountered at the gates of pandemonium. And like the thunder-stricken seraph, he might thus break silence. Whence and what art thou, execrable shape, that darest, though grim and terrible, advance thy miscreated front athwart my way? What thing thou art, thus double formed, and why in this infernal vale first met thou calledst me father, and that phantom calledst my son? I know thee not, and never saw till now sight more detestable than him and thee, to whom his own darling philosophy, now transformed into naked, hideous atheism, might reply, Hast thou forgot me, then, and do I seem now in thine eye so foul, once deem'st so fair, when at the assembly with thee combined in bold conspiracy against heaven's king, likest to thee in shape and countenance bright, then shining heavenlies fair, a goddess armed, out of thy head I sprung. Instantly demon anarchy, atheism's natural child, stands forth, fierce as 10 furies, terrible as hell. With earthquake shock he falls upon the hapless father. More successful in the onslaught than his pandemonium prototype, he drags him quivering to the guillotine, and speedily holds up his severed head to the gaze of a frenzied multitude, an everlasting monument of the triumph of philosophy without religion, of the golden age of equal rights, of the Halion reign of unbounded liberty. After an example so recent and so calamitous, would it not indicate something like insanity to attempt to regenerate a country like India by means of human philosophy and human science alone? Hinduism, which is so huge a compound of all that is false, monstrous, and extravagant in every department of knowledge, physical, literary, and religious, could not long resist the vigorous onslaught of European science if conducted on a scale of national magnitude, in the sudden demolition of established systems and established forms, and in the entire absence of positive principles of counteractive power. The newly awakened spirit might spring at one bound into the opposite extreme, manifesting itself in actions and events from the dim and distant contemplation of which, even in imagination, the mind most gladly retires. Exhausted at length by its own convulsive efforts, the skeptical and irreligious spirit might become stripped of all vital energy, while, as in the case of other revolutions, its very excesses of incredulity and indiscriminate outrage might produce a powerful reaction in favor of the ancient creed. The national mind of a people like that of India, among whom the religious sentiment or propensity has ever been manifested with peculiar power, might with greater fervour than ever rally round the standards of a faith which, though fiercely proscribed, had still lingered and survived behind the entrenchment of custom, manners, and usages rendered inveterate by the practice of ages, and might with greater tenacity than ever cling to forms and observances, the abrogation of which had entailed naught but devastation and ruin, and the absence of which had left a vacuum not to be supplied by the dimmest abstractions of science or the frigid speculations of philosophy. In a word, the temples might be repaired, the idols reseated, the offerings and sacrifices renewed, the rites and ceremonies reinstituted, and the festivals celebrated with greater pomp and magnificence than ever. In either case, whether viewed in its direct operation simply as the destroyer without supplying a substitute, or in its reaction as the restorer of a system like that of Hinduism, what becomes of the boasted power of mere human science to raise a people circumstanced as they are the Hindus to the enjoyment of a sort of millennium of temporal bliss? Alas, alas, from first to last, from beginning to end, it is all mockery and delusion, as pregnant with disaster as with disappointment and shame. Constrained by the united voice of reason and experience, many of the leaders of public opinion on such subjects as the present have at length confessed that nowhere is ignorant, vicious, enslaved man to be regenerated by mere political, economic, or philosophic reforms. They do now profess to tell us in no faint whispers that morals and religion of some description are absolutely necessary for the organization and maintenance of a free and happy state of society. This is a truth which almost all in every age who have sounded the depths of the human spirit in its varied wants, cravings, and appetencies have been constrained to proclaim. The acknowledgement of it is a concession which often been extorted from the practical penetrative sagacity of men who in their own lives gave fatal evidence that they would falsify it if they could. That religion, remarks Lord Bolingbroke, is necessary to strengthen and that it contributes to the support of government cannot be denied without contradicting reason and experience both. Again, to make government effectual to all good purposes of it, there must be a religion. This religion must be national, and this national religion must be maintained in reputation and reverence. The iron-hearted Robespierre, in that ever-memorable conclave which voted that there was no God, could boldly protest against the political expediency of the decision, exclaiming, "If there were no God, a wise government would invent one." Napoleon, according to the authority of a modern French statesman, was heard on one occasion to declare, "No society can exist without morals, and there can be no sound morals without religion. Hence there is no firm or durable bulwark for a state but what religion constructs. Let therefore every school throughout the land assume the precepts of religion as the basis of instruction. Experience has torn the veil from our eyes. And of late it has become almost the fashion, even in some of our great secular assemblies from the Senate downwards, to moralize in somewhat similar strain. But though the necessity of morals and religion of some kind be now so openly and generally acknowledged, there is the same perverse infatuation as ever in obstinately rejecting the only genuine morality, the only true religion, and that is the Christianity of the Bible, the soul-awakening, soul-purifying gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. To this, however, it must come in the end, when human intellect has put forth all its strength and failed, when human ingenuity has exhausted all its devices in vain, when human reason has stood on the terminating point of the last promontory of that shore which bounds its dominion, and has gazed at the uttermost horizon which circumscribes the range of its expedients without discovering the object of pursuit, then will the spirit of universal man be driven to despair, if not allured by persuasion, to recoil back upon the only real specific, the only infallible panacea, which has been provided by God himself. To talk, as many in high places are at present disposed to do, to speak of resorting to a species of syncretism or eclecticism in religion, somewhat similar to that which characterized the struggles of an expiring paganism, that would open a pantheon for the amicable cohabitation of the gods of all nations, somewhat similar to that which characterized the death throes of heathen philosophy, that would amalgamate the peculiar opinions of the founders of all religions and educe therefrom some depurated ultimate doctrine virtually comprehensive of them all. To talk any longer of resorting to some such scheme as would thus toss the articles and confessions, the liturgies and homilies of all religionists, however heterogeneous, into one intellectual cauldron, so that out of the fermentation consequent of the commingling of such discordant materials, there might bring forth some volatilized substance which may be pronounced the common essence of them all, and then to propose rearing schools and temples wherein this etherealized decoction may be worshipped as a common idol by the countless throngs of votaries between the extremes of massive apostolic Christianity and the unsubstantial shadow of leanest, lankest deism, seriously to talk in this epoch of world's history of any such scheme being practicable is an outrage to all experience. To talk of it as desirable if practicable, an insult to common sense. To talk of it as an optimism, even if practicable, and to the carnal man desirable, a daring affront to the majesty of the Most High. Seeing then that all ameliorating schemes of mere human devising must in the issue prove abortive, that even if success should attend them up to their full measure of capacity for effecting good, they must still prove but poor, weak, and insufficient measures, which will but skin and film the ulcerous part, while rank corruption mining all within infects unseen. What remains but that we should at once betake ourselves to that only effective scheme which is announced and developed in the blessed volume of inspiration. And though that scheme has primarily in view not the physical health and well-being of the body, but the spiritual health and salvation of the soul, not the petty concerns of time, but the momentous interests of eternity, the slightest consideration will suffice to show how the less is necessarily involved in the greater. How an adequate provision for realizing the felicities of heaven is the best and surest guarantee for enjoying the noblest heritage of happiness on earth. In order to be fully assured of this, let us simply ask, what is the central point around which the whole scheme of Hinduism in its theory and practice is made to turn? It is that sinful man, by his own sufficiency, by his own services, his own works, his own meritorious obedience, can propitiate God, to earn to himself a right entitled to immortal bliss. If man really knew God in his holiness, and God's law as the perfect transcript of that holiness, he would be overwhelmed by the conviction of his utter inability to propitiate his offended Maker, or fulfill the whole of his law. Hence, he would be filled with hatred and enmity against that law which must denounce, and that God who must punish all transgression. Hence, too, as he could not altogether shake off the impression of the being and providence of God, or of the obligation of obeying his holy law, he would in time be tempted and impelled to feign a deity like unto himself, and a divine law suited to his own impaired sense of obedience, a deity whom he could appease if he willed, a law which he could fulfill if it suited his good pleasure. Hence, accordingly, the fundamental cause, source, and origin of Hinduism, and of every other false scheme of religion. The system of Hinduism is nothing else than a stupendous superstructure raised upon this one grand central principle as its foundation stone, namely the principle of exclusive self-reliance, exclusive self-righteousness, a self-righteousness far more absolute than that of Roman Catholicism itself, which would combine and harmonize grace and desert, faith and good works. Hence, the countless round of daily and almost hourly rites, ceremonies, and observances, the countless rounds of fastings, pilgrimages, and rehearsals of holy texts, the countless rounds of gifts and offerings and sacrifices, the countless round of ablutions, expiations, and atonements, the countless rounds of austerities, self-inflicted tortures, and religious suicides, the countless round of inquiries into the nature of things, meditations, and absorbed contemplations, all circulate for ever round the grand central but false and detestable principle that man, though fallen and sinful, may work out his own unaided strength a title to the divine, may work out by his own unaided strength a title to the divine favor, a right to celestial rewards or to supreme beatitude. The colossal scheme of Hinduism, as has already been shown, does embrace and intimately incorporate with itself and imaginable departments of tradition, literature, science, and art, but these are like so many columns, capitals, and minarets designed to garnish the inner citadel of self-righteousness, or so many walls, towers, and buttresses intended to render it more firm, secure, and unassailable. This being the foundation stone of the immense fabric of Hinduism, let us now see with what divine precision Christianity is adapted to wrench it from its position, overturn its superimposed office, and drive the plowshare of destruction over the crumbling ruins. For what in the mighty system of revelation is that central truth around which all other truths revolve? It is that not by any exertions, endeavors, works, or sufferings of our own can we ever be justified before God, but solely through the righteousness of God revealed from heaven, the righteousness which God himself hath effected and provided, the real, true, and everlasting righteousness or perfect obedience to the divine law, both in its threatened penalties and inflexible requirements, which was exemplified by Christ our Emmanuel, a righteousness which is freely and gratuitously out of undeserved love and mere mercy imputed to us, and without money or price, doing or suffering, service or merit of any kind, received by faith alone, a righteousness which, when so imputed and received, is as really made over to us as if we ourselves had wrought it out by a perfect fulfillment of precepts of the law in all its penalties and threatenings, as well as precepts and commands, as really accounted to be our own, as if we ourselves had endured the infinite and eternal punishment due to our transgressions, and at the same time had magnified the law and made it honorable by a perfect conformity to all its demands, whether in the way of duties to be performed or of prohibitions to be inviolably respected. The moment this perfect righteousness is, through the instrumentality of that faith which is itself the gift of God, imputed to the believer, he is pardoned and justified from all sin, freed from the sentence of condemnation, acquitted of the guilt of transgression, and entitled to an inheritance which is incorruptible and undefiled, and that fadeth not away, reserved in heaven. No wonder that the bringing in of this finished, this spotless righteousness should be extolled as the chief even of Jehovah's works, the clear manifestation thereof as the crowning excellency of revelation, the universal proclamation thereof as the gospel of the gospel, and the free imputation thereof to hell-deserving rebels as the very consummation of infinite wisdom, holiness, and love. What a revolution would the effectual lodgment of this single primal truth, that we are made righteous before God and continue so by grace alone, through the mere imputation of the righteousness or meritorious obedience and sufferings of Christ, the only perfect righteousness which can be managed, which can be maintained against wrath, sin, death, and hell, achieve in the national mind of a people so impregnated with the spirit of self-righteousness as the native inhabitants of India. And blessed be God that in attempting to secure an effectual lodgment of it in the understandings and hearts of men, we are not left to mere human instruction, to mere human persuasion. No, we have the promise of the presence of the divine Redeemer himself and of the efficacious influence of his Almighty Spirit. Behold then how the believing and influential embracement of this one vital and fundamental doctrine would hurl away the entire mass of morbid fears and legal sentiments and meritorious observances which in the course of ages have grown up into a gigantic system, crushing and paralyzing the souls and bodies of myriads. Let the great body of the people of once brought through the word of truth, sent home by the energy of the Holy Spirit, sing aloud with Luther, "Thou, Lord God, art my righteousness, but I am thy sin. Thou hast taken to thee what was mine, and hast given to me what was thine. Thou hast taken upon thee what thou wast not, and given to me what I was not." And how must the all-comprehending system of Hinduism vanish? An absolute confidence in one almighty, omniscient, omnipresent mediator and advocate would at once supersede the necessity of applying to any one of the legions of secondary mediators, whether on earth or in heaven. How would the power and tyranny of the Brahmanical and celestial hierarchies be forever broken, and the constantly recurring demand for gifts and invocations to secure their favor and intercession be forever removed. An absolute belief that an almighty and all-merciful Redeemer hath actually fulfilled to the uttermost all the righteous ordinances of an immutable law in the stead of sinners, and that he is both able and willing to impute to them, on believing, his own all-perfect obedience or active righteousness, would at once expose the futility of their own poor, lame, inadequate, self-justifying performances. Hence would flow a clear perception and operative conviction of the worse than uselessness of the attempts to restore peace and comfort in a troubled, pained, and restless conscience, or to earn a heavenly recompense by resorting to the endless rites, forms, and ceremonies with all the half gorgeous, half barbaric pomps and vanities of Brahminical worship, and the whole vast apparatus of works and services of minor, secondary, or transcendent merit. For who, to adopt once more one of Luther's pointed expressions, who that could soar with eagle's wings to the sun of righteousness itself, would not be rejoiced to throw away his crutches? An absolute assurance that an almighty Saviour hath actually offered himself in the stead of sinners as a complete oblation and satisfaction to divine justice, and that he has thereby drained off the full cup of merited retribution and exhausted the full measure of threatened vengeance, must lay bare the utter nugatoriness of the endeavour to supplant or supplement, in whole or in part, an all perfect and freely imputed passive righteousness by any voluntary sufferings of their own. Hence at once would be swept away the boundless variety of self-inflicted austerities, penances, and mortifications, which are intended to diminish and gradually to exhaust the amount of penalties incurred by transgression, as well as the entire host of impedients designed to effect a deliverance from the purgatorial processes of transmigration into this world and of penal severities in the regions below.